Good morning and welcome everyone to the viewing and listening audience to this, the 12th meeting of the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration. This is the committee's first hearing with stakeholders pursuant to its inquiry into the state's capacity to provide support for victims of domestic violence and family conflicts, with special focus on the availability of support mechanisms during the COVID-19 pandemic. Members of the public are invited to submit your comments and questions to the Parliament's social media platforms, including our YouTube channel, ParlView, or via our Facebook and Twitter platforms. I'm the committee's chairman, Paul Richards. The stakeholders before us today include the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and of course the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. At this time, I'd like to invite members of the committee to introduce themselves, starting with Member Beckles.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair. Penelope Beckles, Member, Minister of Planning and Development. Thank you.
Thank you. MP Mohit and Member Mohit.
Good morning and thank you. Good morning and thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to all members. I am Vandana Mohit, member of the committee and member of Parliament for Shubuana East. Looking forward.
Thank you, Member Nakid.
Good morning to all. I am David Nakid, Opposition Senator, a member of the committee.
Thank you. There are two members who will join us in process, Member Rohan Sinanan and Member Esmond Ford, MP. The two members who have asked to be excused, including Member Roger Monroe and Member Avinash Singh. The inquiry's objectives include the four following objectives. One, to examine trends in domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago for the period March 2020 to March 2022, compared with previous periods. To examine the state's policies, projects, initiatives aimed at providing support to domestic violence victims and survivors. To examine the capacity of state-funded organizations and institutions to provide adequate support to victims of domestic violence. And four, to evaluate the effectiveness of support provided to domestic violence victims by the state for the period March 2020 to present. At this time, I'd like to invite opening statements from the leads of the four stakeholder groups with us today. We can start with Mrs. Jacinta Bailey-Sobers, who is the Permanent Secretary in the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs. Mrs. Bailey-Sobers.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to you and to members of the committee. The officers of the Gender and Child Affairs Division here with me this morning, my colleagues from the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, the TTPS, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Service, members of the public viewing and listening to this session. The Gender and Child Affairs Division is committed to serving the needs of society through the implementation of its important mandate. We are happy to be a part of this session and to provide information on the support we lend to victims of domestic violence and family conflict, and to also receive suggestions, Chair, on how our services and systems may be improved. This session is indeed a timely one, and coincidentally, it's occurring simultaneously with the launch of the Essential Services Package to women and girls who are victims of violence in Trinidad and Tobago in another place. The ASP focuses on the minimum standards for gender-based violence and emergency prevention and response program. Very briefly, Chair, I wish to inform those who may not be aware that the Gender Affairs Division is the national focal point for gender and development in Trinidad and Tobago, and its mandate includes the promotion of principles of gender equity, equality through gender mainstreaming, including the development of gender-sensitive policies and programs. And of course, the draft National Policy on Gender Development guides the work of the division. The division also has responsibility for the hotline 800 SAVE and also the one government-run shelter. Gender and Child Affairs Division looks forward to the upcoming rich discussions here in terms of the area that we are focusing on this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey Sobers. And of course, with you will be Ms. Gayatri Pargas, Senior Legal Advisor, Mrs. Anne-Marie Kwame Allen, Coordinator National Policy and Gender and Development. And we just want to advise that your Assistant Coordinator National Domestic Shelters will not be identified visually or by name. Is that correct?
Yes.
For security reasons. So we just want to advise that. So if you defer to that person, we'll identify the person only as the Assistant Coordinator, National Domestic Shelters. Thank you. We move now to Ms. Jacqueline Johnson, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, to present brief opening remarks and also present the members of your team with us today.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee, and my fellow colleagues. The Ministry of Social Development provides a range of social services in support of vulnerable persons. One of the key divisions involved in supporting families and victims of and perpetrators of violence is the National Family Services Division. We are pleased to be part of this appreciative and constructive inquiry, given the objectives outlined. I thank you.
Thank you so much. And the other members of your team include Ms. Kathleen Sankar, who is the Assistant Director, National Family Services Division, and Ms. Cindy Hiralal, Coordinator, Non-Governmental Organization. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you so much. We move now to Mrs. Sharon Morris Cummings, Acting Director of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, to deliver opening remarks. Go ahead, please, Mrs. Morris Cummings.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I thank you. Members of the Joint Select Committee, representatives of partner agencies, the Gender and Child Affairs Division of the OPM, the Ministry of Social Development, and the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, members of the viewing public, including our nation's children. Thank you for affording the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago the opportunity to contribute to today's inquiry on the capacity of the state to provide support for victims of domestic violence and family conflicts. Allow me to take this opportunity to extend our condolences to the families, and in particular, the children who have lost their parents as a result of domestic violence, especially in light of what we have seen in recent times. The authority is committed to the care, protection, and rehabilitation of children who come to its attention. Therefore, we will continue to work with agencies within the child protection sector to provide the relevant support to children and their families who are exposed to abuse and trauma. Domestic violence is certainly one context in which many children experience trauma, and we are aware that much more is required to be done to identify and then address the root causes of this scourge. Very often, parents are oblivious to the fact that children are impacted by violence in the home among adults. In fact, more proactive work needs to be done with families to reduce the number of children needing care. While more shelters are required, there's need for expanded counseling services to deal with survivors' trauma, access to skills-based and mentorship programs, low-cost housing options, and job opportunities so that survivors have independent living options when they leave the perpetrators and the shelters. Therefore, we welcome today's discussions and to hear ways in which the system can be improved. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Morris Cummings, Acting Director of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. And with you on your team today also, Mrs. Rhonda Gregoire-Rubchan, Deputy Director, Care Services, and Ms. Elizabeth Lewis, Deputy Director, Acting Legal and Regulatory Services. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much. And now we move to the Acting Commissioner of Police, McDonald Jacob. Mr. Jacob, Acting Commissioner Jacob, please go ahead with your opening remarks and introduction of your team. Commissioner. Commissioner Jacob, are you hearing us? I think we will be having some sort of technical issue there. We'll come back to Commissioner Jacob. As I indicated before, the objectives are to examine trends in domestic violence in TNT for the period March 2020 to March 2022 compared with previous periods, to examine the state's policies, projects, initiatives aimed at providing support for victims and survivors of domestic violence, to examine the capacity of state-funded organizations and institutions to provide adequate support to victims of domestic violence, and 4, to evaluate the effectiveness of support provided to domestic violence victims and survivors by the state for the identified period March 2020 to present. Have we gotten that issue with the TTPS sorted out yet? Commissioner, Acting Commissioner Jacob.
Are you hearing me? Good morning.
Yes, we're hearing you now. Go ahead, Commissioner. Thank you.
Yes, sorry about the delay. Again,
not a problem.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to the entire Joint Select Committee and all other departments who are participating in this morning session, and members of the public. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, as we are aware, we are the primary law enforcement agency as it relates to domestic violence, enforcement of the domestic violence. Fortunately for us, that the present Domestic Violence Act is actually a procedural act that indicates exactly how the police should in fact operate from the time of a report being made to the police, and even in instances where we have to enter premises. When we have set up our Special Victims Department, which includes the gender department, our gender-based violence unit, and in setting up the Special Victims Department is to deal both with the aspect of dealing with domestic violence, dealing with young persons where we have the Child Protection Unit, and also sexual offenses. Because from our experience, there is some interlink when there are reports made dealing with the 3 different factors. We also provide that psychosocial support, interim psychosocial support to victims. So our victim support unit also plays a very, very important role as it relates to that aspect, to deal with both primary and secondary victims, and later on to deal with the survivors of domestic violence. We are in partnership with the NGOs and the other government departments in order to deal with this in an effective manner. Again, with my team here this morning, we are here to present from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service side in how we can really operate in partnership to bring and to get rid of this scourge that we are having in our country as it relates to domestic violence, which on several occasions really end up in the death of individuals. So again, thank you very much, and we are here to make our contribution and to work as a team to deal with this situation.
Thank you, Commissioner. And of course, with the Commissioner today is Mrs. Sharon Gomez-Cooper, Assistant Commissioner, Police Criminal Division, Mrs. Claire Guy Allen, Superintendent, Gender-Based Violence and Child Protection Unit, and Ms. Aisha Corby, Manager, Victim and Witness Support Unit of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. For the purposes of this inquiry, we're going to identify the definition of domestic violence as provided by the Gender-Based Violence Unit. That's a schedule of offenses outlined in the Domestic Violence Act, Chapter 4556 as amended. And under the Act, domestic violence includes physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological or financial abuse committed by a respondent against a person who is in a domestic relationship with the respondent. And in relation to domestic relationship, it means the relationship between a respondent and a person where the person is any one of the following: a spouse or former spouse, a cohabitant or former cohabitant, a child, a dependent, a relative, a person who has agreed to marry the respondent, whether or not the agreement has been terminated. And in relation to the respondent, a person in a visiting relationship or a person in a dating relationship. So the amended act has been quite widely amended to include some of the circumstances that have evolved over years in terms of domestic situations in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to thank the TTPS for the information they provided to the Secretariat, because it gives us a data-driven look at the phenomenon as it exists in Trinidad and Tobago to March 2022. And if we look at the data provided by the TTPS, for the period March 2018 to March 2020, there were 2,710 reports of domestic violence received by the TTPS. So for March 2018 to March 2022, 2,710 reports. When we compare the same period, March 2020 to March 2022, that rose significantly from 2,710 to 4,857 reports of domestic violence. That is a striking increase to me. That is one of the first things that struck out to me by the data provided by the TTPS, which by my simple calculations roughly translates to just under seemingly 7 reports a day in various categories. If we break it down by division, in terms of the total number of domestic violence reports for the period March 2019 to March 2022, Central Division 964, Eastern Division 613, Northeastern Division 287, Northern Division 1,423, Port of Spain 402, Southwestern 506, Southern Division 835, Tobago 848, and the Western Division 372. Now keep in mind that's for the period March 2019 to March 2022. So I want to keep the time frames in context, and that is a total of 6,250 reports of domestic violence between March 2019 to March 2022. Now, if we keep the time frame in mind, according to the data we're seeing around the world, it corresponds with the start of the pandemic into the pandemic, right? In terms of the types of offenses, in terms of data provided for the same time period, March 2019 to March 2022, assault by beating, 3,526. Breach of protection order, and we're going to asterisk that for later reference, 581. Child abuse and abandonment, 23. Financial abuse, 4. Homicide, 115. Malicious damage, 91. Psychological abuse, 5. Sexual abuse, 28. Threats, 1,539. Verbal abuse, 84. Wounding, 254, which corresponds to a total of 6,250, again, between the period March 2019 to March 2022. This aggregated by gender: female reports, 4,921, male reports, 1,333. And for the period of March 2019 to March 2021, in terms of responses, female responses, and let me just get this right, there were 575 female offenders and 4,661 or 4,061 male offenders. So I would like to thank the TTPS, because that data is of great use to us understanding the progression of the phenomenon pre-pandemic, and certainly the sharp rise in numbers from March 2019, which is corresponds to the start of the pandemic, into March 2022. So let me start the first question, and I'll defer to my colleague, Member Beckers, in a short while, to the TTPS what are the factors that your analysis department may have come up with that may have contributed or may be contributing to that significant rise in reports of domestic violence?
Well,
I don't know which of the TTPS would like to take that.
Well, in the first instance, the change in the law had a significant effect when we included persons in dating relationships in 2000. Before that, our data will not include persons in dating relationships. That would have gone under what we call basically altercation. Therefore, from 2000, it's now started including our 2020, it will now be included under the whole aspect of domestic. So that is one. Number two, we now, by the establishment of our special victims unit, which you all will all know as the gender-based violence unit, and they went about throughout our country in doing the awareness of the whole aspect of domestic violence and providing that comfort and confidence to persons out there who wish to make reports. Thus, the dark figure reduced tremendously during that period where persons were willing to come forward and make reports, not just to carry up the numbers, but be provided with the solutions and the treatment that was required in order to deal with their issues. So thus, those are these two of the main factors that really caused the figures to go up in spite of the pandemic, in addition to the pandemic. Yes, go ahead, yes.
So if I'm correct in understanding, one, the reporting mechanism where persons in dating relationships were now able to report.
Yes.
One. And two, the other issue you identified, do you get a sense, because this is phenomenon, data that's been recorded around the world, that the fact that people were, in many cases, when the lockdowns occurred, domiciled together for long periods would have been a contributing factor, because that is one of the factors that other jurisdictions have identified in terms of issues that weren't resolved in domestic situations that would have been intensified or exacerbated because of the pandemic and the lockdown periods.
Yes, we are also saying that is also a factor, but we also wanted to include those other variables because we don't want it to ascribe to just the increase only in relation to the pandemic. And there are some other things that the gender-based unit did also, so I will pass on to Ms. Guy Allen to explain some of the outreach that they implemented that more than likely may have encouraged persons to go about coming even during the pandemic and with the technology to make reports. Ms. Guy Allen, thanks.
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Chair. Good morning to our colleagues and the entire listening population. We are so happy to be here this morning because domestic violence, gender-based violence is a scourge in society. And I am saying that we can get rid of this scourge once we work together. Now, in 2020, with the formation of the gender-based violence unit within the TTPS, which is now under the Special Victims Department, we approached this scourge very aggressively. What we tried to do also was to ensure that we had enforcement of the laws that were available to us. For example, within the TTPS, we try to ensure that we spread the word between that we are operating with a zero tolerance approach when it comes to domestic violence report. We also use the platform of the Zoom, the Teams, in order to spread the word throughout Trinidad and Tobago as to what is domestic violence? Because a lot of persons, what we recognize, they were in domestic violence relationship and they were not even aware. So we brought about that awareness, and we also, we taught the public how to navigate their way to the police so that we can be able to investigate these matters. So we created an atmosphere where persons were comfortable to come forward. We allow them to let them understand how they can make reports, for example, through the 999, through the online reporting as well as the TTPS app. So all of these avenues created that avenue where persons were able to make more reports and these reports to be investigated.
Thank you. One more question before I pass on to my colleague, Member Beckles. In terms of the types of offenses you listed in your data provision, assault by beating 3,526, threats 1,539. What strikes out to me is the breach of protection order 581. First of all, define for us what is a breach of protection order, what constitutes that, and how does the TTPS respond to that? What are the avenues available under the law to the TTPS in terms of breach of protection order, and how does that affect persons who've obtained protection orders because they feel their lives are threatened or their lives have been threatened? And how does the law, because it has been a topic of discussion in the public domain about the response to protection orders and if they are as effective as they should be, not necessarily casting blame, but trying to understand how they are supposed to work.
Well, I will start from the last comment that you made, right? What is happening is that it is very difficult, and what we don't do is the measurement to see how many protection orders in itself provided protection for persons. However, when a protection order is violated and someone is hurt, yes, we put it out there in the public. But we want to say from our side that, in fact, protection orders are, in fact, working well, and we have seen several perpetrators really curtail their behavior as a result of protection orders. According to the Domestic Violence Act in itself, you have the protection order, you have first where you can have an undertaking that when the matter come before the court, an individual can in fact volunteer and say, well, as this matter is going on, I will curtail myself from doing X, Y, and Z. It might be being within interfering, being 200 yards of the victim, right? And stopping some of the activities. So that will be the agreement within the court. And that undertaking falls under the aspect of a protection order, but a certain type. Then you have the interim order, which is also where the court will make that interim order for a period as the matter is before the court and being heard. When the matter is completed before the court, then when you will have the actual protection order. But in all instances, this order that is made, either of the three orders, it is sent to the police, to the station district, that the stations will know in fact that there is in fact this order out there. Also, the person who made the report, the victim, will also have a copy of that order. So, and the person responsible, right, he also, the defendant, he will also be served with that protection order, knowing all the conditions. And the magistrate will also inform him of the conditions and he mustn't violate it. It works like that. And if it so happens that he violates the order, the person, he or she violates the order, let me put it in that context, right? He or she violates the order, they can contact the police, and the protection order now gives the police the opportunity that they can institute an arrest. Because as you're aware that some of the offenses that you are looking at, like basic assault and beat, and as we said, it could be financial, it could be several different forms of domestic violence that may occur. The police may not be in a position that they can in fact institute an arrest because of the particular offense unless it is committed within their view. But the protection order now gives the police that power that once they violated, just coming within 100 yards, just making calls to the person and violating the law, then the police now is given that powers of arrest that they can arrest that person and bring that person before the court. So the protection order gives the police that extra power, even though we may be dealing with matters which may not in normal terms give the police a powers of arrest. So basically that is what the protection order is about. It is a shield right? The Protection Order and the Domestic Violence Act, as I said, is a shield. It is not a sword because it is linked to the other legislation like the Summary Offences Act, the Offences Against the Person Act, which comes in there. So the charges, the only time the charges will come under the Domestic Violence Act is when they violates the protection order or violates the bail conditions. So that is what it's all about, providing that extra impetus and powers to the police that they can in fact act to protect victims of domestic violence.
Thank you, Commissioner. Member Beckles, go ahead, please. The floor is yours. I think Member Beckles probably got bumped off. While we wait for Member Beckles to come back in, and I'll open the floor to other members of the committee to pose questions to the TTPS.
Yes, please.
Member Naked, go ahead, please.
Acting Commissioner Jacobs.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I just looking for a matter of procedure. Since you have with you Ms. Guy Allen, I think it is, who's in charge of gender and child. I'm just looking at a matter of procedure. If, for example, we have a body like the Children's Authority who has a complaint or somebody escaped from the authority, would they contact first the police service? What would be the procedure?
Mr. Naked, repeat your question. Repeat your question again, please. Thank you.
Okay, since you are in charge of gender and child abuse, I think you are, I'm asking if a body like the Children's Authority, the wards in their care, the children in their care, if they escape from that authority, one of the homes in that authority, what would be the procedure as regards the Children's Authority? Would they contact you first of all?
Yes, they would contact us, but however, their first port of call would be to make contact with the station district in which the institution is at the time.
Okay, so they would contact the TTPS?
Yes.
All right. Would that call be recorded? Would you have data of that? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, since I'm not one to dawdle on ceremony, we've had recent cases, and I'm concerned about, of course, as we all are, to maintain the credibility of the TTPS in all circumstances. We are fully in support of the work that you do. So I'm asking, would you make available to the committee, the chairman, a recorded call or the data that verifies that the Children's Authority called to you?
Yes. That is not the remit of this committee.
It is not?
No, it's not.
Why is it not, Chairman?
It is not the remit of we are inquiring into the systems and processes to deal with domestic violence cases. And you're asking about a specific case in this instance. And that is not the necessary remit of this committee. To provide whether or not a call was made to.
Chairman, there's no specific.
Yes, Member Naked, I'm ruling, please move on from that line of questioning. Do you have other questions?
Yeah, yes, I do.
Go ahead, please.
To Acting Commissioner Jacobs. Acting Commissioner Jacobs.
Yes, I'm hearing you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not hearing you.
Go ahead, Member Naked.
I'm not hearing you.
Okay. It was widely reported, and we're just looking for some clarification. What are the updates, or can we get an update as to that situation where Simeon Daniel and Antonio Franca were killed, and it was widely reported that the people that killed them were just in police uniforms? Do you have any updates to give us on that?
Member Naked, if it's a criminal investigation ongoing, this
Chairman, Acting Commissioner Jacobs can tell me that. He can tell me it's ongoing.
Member Naked, this forum is not for that. Please. Do you have any other questions?
Not at this time, Chairman.
Thank you. Member Beckles, I see you're back. Go ahead, please.
Oh gosh, finally. So I missed most of, so I'm not even certain where you are. You realize that I was.
We are with the TTPS and you can go through your issues paper. So that's
Okay,
fine. You're welcome.
Okay, so yes, so that's, thank you, Chairman. Can I first ask, what is the relationship between the RHAs and the TTPS regarding persons who enter hospitals for assistance and are suspected victims of domestic violence?
Commissioner?
Yes, good morning. The relationship between the RHAs and the TTPS is one that I would describe as fair, in that sometimes we experience a bit of difficulty in obtaining medicals for our investigation. For example, if a medical is conducted today, we have to make an application for that medical. And in some instances, it takes about 3 weeks to obtain that particular medical. And that sort of stymies our investigation in some cases. For example, if it's a simple assault by beating, I can give the instruction to proceed without the medical. But when we have stuff like broken wounds, broken bones, we need, the medical is critical during this investigation in order to classify the crime to charge for. So that is one issue that we have with respect to the RHAs at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. And I just want to make reference to your submission that indicated for the period March 2018 to March 2020, 2,710 reports of domestic violence cases were received, and for March 2020 to March 2022, 4,815 reports were received. So I'd just like to ask, given that there has been an increase of 2,105 reported cases, what plans does the TTPS, in conjunction with other agencies and NGOs, intend to implement to reduce the number of domestic violence cases? And if I could just ask two more in relation to that, what is the TTPS procedures should a victim with a protection order file a report of domestic violence with the TTPS? And the last one in this category is, how effective have the protection orders been for victims against their perpetrators? Thank you very much.
Just repeat the first part of your question, please.
Yeah, okay, so it's really just to say that the fact that there is an increase on the reported cases, what plans does the TTPS in conjunction with other agencies and NGOs intend to implement to reduce the number of domestic violence cases?
Yes.
So it's just whether you're working in conjunction with other agencies and NGOs.
Well, definitely we have that coordination. We had meetings with the various government departments, and Ms. Ellen will go a little deeper in that relationship and how we can work together and go into the communities in order to educate persons and bring them up to scratch in how to really and truly to deal with the whole aspect of domestic violence. We have several programs in place, but the part I really want to deal with before I hand over to Ms. Allen, right, who are the operators, and they will explain that, is in relation to what I said earlier, that some of the numbers that we are seeing, number one, is because of the change in the law, where we now include a person's in dating relationship, will fall under domestic violence from since 2020. And before, that was not included. So the numbers now will increase, because before, even though persons were making reports concerning relationship issues, it went simply under the normal assault and beat, or the normal malicious damage. It just fall under the normal acts. right? And if it is a murder, it goes under altercation. Now it will be placed purely under domestic violence. And then the effort made by the Special Victims Unit officers by going out there and educating the population and about the reporting procedure. And they recognize that our victim support officers are also there to provide that psychosocial support and refer them to the other agencies to get help to resolve their family issues, persons who are more willing to come out and make reports. And again, we had the issue of the pandemic. So I just wanted to emphasize that in relation to the numbers, to say that a lot of these reports were being made even before, but it is now being recorded and placed under domestic violence. And I will now hand over to Ms. Guyalin to answer the other.
Well, just before Ms. Allen responds, thank you very much, Acting Commissioner. So it means I think that explanation would probably need to be communicated a little more to the public, because you know the interpretation or the assumption is that there is this substantial increase in domestic violence as distinct from what you are explaining now. So I think that may be interesting if the public is actually made aware of that. Thank you very much.
Definitely, I'm sure our corporate communication will do some work and our media ambassadors to alert the public in relation to the change, because that can spiral out of control in relation to that aspect of domestic violence. And I remember years ago, we had a similar situation with kidnapping and kidnapping for ransom. And when they went to the point to say that Trinidad and Tobago is a kidnapping capital, but then we had to spend time to explain to them the difference between kidnapping and kidnapping for ransom. And we had made a change in the law at that time, and we pulled out kidnapping for ransom. But there were some persons who were actually just ascribing the normal kidnapping like kidnapping for ransom. So we'll do the work, and we'll alert the public, right, when we have our press conferences and our media ambassadors to alert them of that phenomenon. So thank you. Ms. Guyalin?
Yes, Ms. Beckles, I want to thank you for your question, because within your question itself is the answer and the solution to eradicating gender-based violence, domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the police, we cannot do it alone. And we must have a sort of a multi-sectorial or a multi-pronged approach to gender-based and domestic violence within Trinidad and Tobago. We each have a part to play. The NGOs, the judiciary, you know, the medical institutions, the police, we all have a part to play. And we have had relationships. Recently, Commissioner would have had a meeting with the Ministry of Social Development, and we are coming up with a plan in order to work together to be able to approach DV in a sort of, you know, structured and aggressive way. We also have where the Special Victims Department, Gender-Based Violence Unit, we continue and we would aggressively pursue outreach and sensitization within Trinidad and Tobago to continue to bring that awareness. Because one of the things that I observe when we do the sensitization is that a lot of persons are in domestic violence relationship and they don't know, they do not realize that here's what, I'm in a domestic violence relationship. And we sort of let them understand how they can make the reports. It may not be for the matter to even go to court, but just that sort of intervention in the early stages of that domestic violence relationship can prevent the domestic violence from continuing. Because I am of the belief, and I'm sure the commissioner and the executive and everyone here today is of the belief that we can eradicate DV from this country. We need to eradicate it so that, and we are also having a program, because we have to have this conversation from a very, 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 very early stage in one's life. We are also liaising with the schools to sensitize children from a very young and tender age Because some of the violence we are seeing in school, these violence is perpetrated in school. But I am of the opinion that some of these things are happening in the home. Children are taught that you deal with conflict with violence. And we need to change that narrative in Trinidad and Tobago. We need to let persons understand how to socialize, and conflict would always happen. But how we deal with the conflict, and we have to have the conversation from a tender age. How we deal with the conflict is important. Yes?
Member Beckles, we have time for one more question for the TTPS, then we move to Member Mohit for the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child. So one more question, please. Member Beckles.
Okay. All right, so that's what I would ask is that, let me ask, what are your submissions stated that the accessibility of victims' information through external police stations is out of control of the unit at this stage. What are the confidentiality procedures for the protection of victims' information at external police stations? And what are the penalties if there's a breach of confidentiality of the victim's information?
No, you're aware that we have 72 police locations throughout Trinidad and Tobago. And in spite of having the special victims unit, and they are based in what we call regions, most of our reports will be made at the police stations. When these reports are made, they actually are made and go on a coded crime and incident report form, which then goes onto the police records management database, onto this database. And then the forms are now filed and secured by the SDO in charge of the station. The reports must be there, but the question of confidentiality is more based on when most of the investigators, whether it's from the station, and in most of the time it's from the special victims unit, will conduct the investigations. That is where the in-depth statements are taken from the victims and witnesses and kept in a file that is not accessible to anyone but the investigator and the teams who will be dealing with the investigation. So the only thing that will be present, will be available in the initial stages, is in fact the initial report made by the victim. It will also be available, that basic report will also be available to the crime analyst, who now will be putting all the data together to do the analytical work to provide some of the information that is provided by all today. So our system, our records management database is designed in such a way that even though information goes onto it, there are only certain persons who have certain privileges. So some persons just have privileges to query and view, and some persons have privileges to go deeper within the system. So there. So
can I just, so based on your question, because I know the chairman, I have to wrap up. So is it that you're saying that the public can feel relatively comfortable that there's a process in place for the concerns as it relates to confidentiality?
Yeah, definitely. And anyone who enters the database who have access and they put in their password to enter, and if anything is done, we will know. And then action.
And is there any penalty in the event that actually happens? Well, or do you find it very rare for something like that to happen?
It is rare to happen, but our police service regulations cater for that, where the persons and through our disciplinary process, if any information is extracted and provided anywhere and they are not authorized, they can in fact be subject to disciplinary proceedings. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. As we say, great to the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs Division. I have question for the TTPS, which is a question that can also be answered by the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs Division, and then we will go to Member Mohit for the interrogation of that entity before us. And the question first to the TTPS and then to the OPM, Child and Gender, is in relation to reports of child abuse in the context that we've seen in the media in recent times, where some people have seemingly crossed the line in terms of what they consider punishment, which in some people's opinion translates to child abuse. In one, we just had a case in the public domain where a child was taken for supposed correction and ended up, according to the autopsy, to have significant internal injuries. What is the TTPS protocol on that in the context of protecting children from abuse shrouded or masquerading as punishment or correction or discipline? And that question can also go to the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, because it has been a primary discussion in the public domain recently where corporal punishment is allowed for parents of children, but different people have different interpretations of how far that can go. In some instances, many people believe it translates into child abuse and violence against some children.
Well, the criminal law is clear in relation to the chastisement of children and going over the line. And once reports are made to us, and we are aware of it, like any other report, in some instances we have the death of children, and we see that in those instances we investigate and we go by the DPP, and sometimes we get instructions in some instances to charge for murder if there was in fact the intent, and in some instances for manslaughter, where the person was so negligent in their actions that caused the death of the child. And even instances where we find young persons, these children were drowned in these makeshift pools. You know, we have instances like that. So the Transact is clear in relation to the neglect by persons who are responsible for young persons.
But I'm going to ask the question. I'm not being facetious in the slightest bit. What is the line? And I know we all should know what the line is in terms of children being physically harmed or psychologically harmed or emotionally harmed. But the society is so diverse and people have different perspectives on what this line is. And it can't be that the line is when the child is killed or seriously injured. There must be some sort of understanding as to what this line is that constitutes discipline as opposed to abuse. And there to me is where the vagary lies.
You see, the law in itself, as I said, the criminal law is there, and if a child is beaten beyond a particular causing injuries also to the child, it amounts to an offense. The line is sort of blurred in relation to it. But the point is that in the criminal law, they allow the chastisement of the child, but to what extent? And you cannot go to that point to beat a child or to harm a child to the point where the child sustains injuries. Injuries, any sort of injuries to the skin, to the bones or whatsoever, that amount to a criminal act, and the person will in fact be charged. So when persons assault the children and they are taken to the hospital, or neighbors also make the report to the police, and we go there, we will take the person to the doctor, the DMO, and according to the medical that we have, we will in fact charge the persons, and it's for all the different offenses: assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Once it reach to that level, which is a low level, assault occasion, basic actual or basic assault and beat, and there are injuries, the person will be charged. So there's a very, very thin line, and sometimes the medical, right, and the information from the child will decide whether or not the person should be charged.
Thank you. Member Mohit, go ahead, please. Thank you, Commissioner and team. Member Mohit, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs Division. As I continue, in terms of the report submitted, the submission indicated that the Spotlight initiative addresses family and domestic violence with specific focus on Tunapuna, Piarco, Mayaro, Rio Claro, as well as Tobago. In terms of the responding agency, for the benefit of the viewing public, can you please explain the rationale for focusing on these particular communities? And in addition to that, the Spotlight initiative also spoke of planning activities for phase 2. Can you state for us what are the key components of this particular phase 2?
For the question, number, are you hearing me properly?
Not so well, but I'll try my best.
Okay, I will also try to remove my mask for a short while. That might be a hindrance. Are you hearing me better?
Hearing you better.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks for the question. Yes, those communities, of course, were selected based on the data. We would have received, we would have had data within the division, which had been collected, and we would have identified these 3 areas in terms of the incidence of domestic violence. So the projects would have been identified to be conducted in these areas. Of course, you would have received the information in terms of the Spotlight and the fact that there are 6 particular areas that are covered, pillars, they call them, related to legislation, related to institutions, related also to the services that are provided and so on. So these various areas were covered even within the areas that were selected, but in particular, the projects in those areas were related to the organizations, especially the community service organizations in those areas that treat with domestic violence. So capacity was built with respect to those organizations to ensure that they could provide a more effective service. And also we had persons who were mobilized in the area and who were trained up so that they could also train others in terms of identifying, sensitizing, educating about domestic violence and the processes and the procedures to treat with it. So those were some of the areas that were addressed within that aspect of the project. Now, of course, under the different pillars that I spoke about, legislation, services, institutions, there were a number of projects that were undertaken through the Spotlight. You asked about phase 2. Phase 2 is going to address more or less those projects that started in phase 1 but were not completed, and also to expand those that were implemented but worked well. So for example, under gender and child affairs, we had a foundations program, and that fell under the strengthening and changing attitudes towards gender-based violence, where persons were trained up to go out and train others in terms of changing their behavior, changing their attitude, and we are continuing in phase 2 to treat with some new target groups. We are working with an organization with persons with disabilities. We are working with the prison, and we are working with one other group, training them up within this area of sensitization and education and changing behavior towards domestic violence so that they now could go into their institutions and do the same. So you have that ripple effect. So that is one area where there's going to be an expansion, and there are also expansions in the area of education with respect to the health and family life education curriculum, with the police, with the judiciary, and so on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the TTPS figures, as well as the figures outlined under Gender and Child Affairs, how strong is your relationship with the TTPS in terms, and how strong was that in terms of determining these particular areas and pillars by which you've worked in terms of, the Spotlight Initiative, seeing that, the TTPS is attempting so hard in terms of attacking domestic violence?
We have a very strong relationship with the TTPS, of course, because they are part of the framework for addressing domestic violence. And under the Spotlight Initiative, they played a very important role under the legal and the policy framework, and also in the area of institutions. So a number of projects were done with judiciary and the TTPS. And of course, part of the Spotlight, there's also a committee, a multi-sectoral committee that was responsible for working with the UN Women, which is the main UN agency responsible for the Spotlight, to implement the project. So the TTPS played a very important role, and they do play an important role with us in terms of what we do. Sensitization, education, and also just simply the process for reporting in terms of our shelters and so on. They are the ones that actually identify most of the persons that end up in the sole government shelter. So we have to work very closely with the
Sure, thanks a lot. Mr. Chair, before I move to the next question, in looking at all the reports provided to us, the TTPS figures are very high as compared to the other reports in terms of dealing with domestic violence. And one of the things that I would like to recommend is that futuristically, if we can have some form of succession added in terms of a column or so in terms of reporting, so we are aware of the type of assistance agencies are providing to TTPS if we are labeling and stating this as an aggressive approach, so that the members of the public are privy to this information. So one, it deters, and the other one is that persons can feel free to come forward. So with that being said, I'll move to my other question, Mr. Chair. In terms of your submission, it would have indicated that Gender and Child Affairs provides support to safe houses operated by NGOs. Can you state for us what is the nature of this support provided to safe houses operated by NGOs?
Have one shelter that is run by government, which we provide full support and funding to. The support that we will provide to the other shelters, which are really privately run shelters, providing support financially through Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. So we fully fund the government-run facility, but the other private facilities, I think 2 of them are funded by social development.
What is the reporting mechanism in terms of these particular agencies or support, well, the safe houses, NGOs, etc., that you provide support to? What's the reporting mechanism? Because you're providing financial support, of course, but you must have some form of reporting mechanism. Are you provided with that?
So on our side, with respect to the government shelter that we operate, we have reports coming back to the central office. Every month we have reports coming back. We are aware of how many persons are there and general operations, because we have oversight of that. In terms of the private organizations, we don't provide them with finances. It's social development, and I would imagine that they have a reporting system. They may wish to speak to that.
Fine. Another question for you would be that of in terms of male victims of domestic violence, because your submission indicated that there were no shelters for male victims of domestic violence. Can you state for us why there are no shelters for male victims of domestic violence, and whether the ministry believe that there ought to be shelters for male victims of domestic violence? Because we've just heard it from the TTPS, a lot of reports include male victims.
So yes, the division works on the principle of equity, and so we also have planned the setting up of a facility for males. Actually, it was always on the drawing board. However, we had to shift in terms of our plans because of need. There was greater need for shelters for women with their children, and so we also had a collaboration with the Children's Authority where they were in need of a facility as an emergency, and so we would have agreed that we will give that facility to them to house children that needed to be accommodated, and we are now working on the establishment of that shelter for the males. So we received approval for the staff, and we are working. We also already have the facility. It's just to actually do the infrastructural works to set it up, and we are trusting that by before the end of the year we will have that facility up and running for the males. Yeah. We also got approval to work on a male facility for rehabilitation of perpetrators, and we are also very seriously working on that particular one, because we feel that it's going to make a dent in the entire situation, especially with respect to restraining orders, because once a male perpetrator gets that order or is served that order, we know sometimes what could happen. And if we have this facility where they can go and get help, we feel that it is going to reduce the incidence of harm that comes to women when these orders are served.
Sure. In terms of your submission, all 5 safe houses used by OPM Gender Child Affairs are equipped to accommodate female domestic violence victims and their children. Can you state for us if whether there is any restriction on the age and or gender of children that can be accommodated at these facilities? And if yes, please state. Can you also state for us how does Gender Child Affairs maintain the confidentiality of the location or locations of these safe houses, and whether there have been any instances where perpetrators were able to discover the location of these facilities? And if yes, if you can state for us how this was dealt with. Of course, protecting persons.
Oh, so I am aware that the shelter that is government run, there is no restriction with respect to the children. Even with the boys, they can actually be accommodated up to 18, which means they're still a child, under 18, of course. But for the private shelters, I believe there is some restrictions. I will ask our shelter administrator to provide information on this and some of the questions that you just asked.
Good morning to Chairman and committee members. In terms of our shelter, how it's run, we do accommodate boys and girls up to the age of 18. We also have accommodation for 24 people, and in terms of their support, we provide psychotherapeutic support and also case management services for the individuals. Under the psychotherapeutic support, we have individual, group, and family counseling. We also have holistic wellness programs, meditation, Zumba, arts and craft, poetry, and other activities for children, life skills training, parenting classes, livelihood skills, which include cooking classes. We have also a Blue Box initiative. Under the case management services, we provide medical support, which includes clinical and hospital visits, also connection with psychiatric support. We provide social services, which will provide grants and other document retrieval for our clients. Legal services, as was mentioned earlier, protection orders and other legal aids. And there is employment support, housing support, educational support, which was provided during the pandemic, where we are still in an endemic, the virtual classes. Now that it has changed, we are trying to readdress how we are going to provide educational support. We also provide connection for our clients to a health support system for when they have re-entry into society, for family reconciliation in terms not with the perpetrator, but other family members. Also, donation, we provide donation of clothing. As I said before, the reintegration into society, and we do a follow-up and aftercare support for all of our clients.
Sure. And finally, your submission indicated that some of the domestic violence shelters which operated between 2018 and 2020 are no longer in operation. Can you state for us what were the factors that contributed to these shelters not being operational?
Most of those shelters were privately owned and run, so we don't have the information in terms of why they closed up their doors, but we would imagine it may have been some financial constraints.
You previously stated that you will provide financial assistance.
Development.
What's that? Okay.
National development, not gender and child.
Sure.
Thank you, Member Mohit. Just before we go to Member Naked and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, to the OPM, two questions. One, the question I posed earlier on to the TTPS, does the OPM Ministry Gender and Child Affairs Division have a position on the management of corporal punishment, given what has happened in some instances in the public domain regarding people crossing the line, parents crossing the line from what may be considered appropriate punishment and discipline to abuse?
We are guided by the legislation, as TTPS would have indicated, and of course through our sensitization and education, we do let persons know what is the national policy with respect to corporal punishment, and we do partner with our Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago also in terms of sensitizing and educating the public with respect to this particular phenomenon. So
Thank you. And two, given the recent report about the gaps in the care at some children's homes, has there been a discussion and recommendation process regarding remedying those gaps identified in those children's homes and places of care?
Yes, there has been discussion as the chair of the task force that has been set up to look at the recommendations and to come up with a good plan. We have been meeting with a number of agencies and representatives, and of course, the task force is a multi-sectoral task force, and therefore there are a number of persons from various agencies discussing. And we have also had the voluntarily people who from particular agencies such as the judiciary have volunteered their resources to the task force, and so we are having intense discussions around the gaps.
While the discussions are ongoing, have there been interventions in the homes identified as having problems and challenges in terms of breaches in standards of care? Because while the discussions as ongoing are commendable, there may be still children who are being abused and or not being afforded adequate care in some of these homes that need to be remedied immediately. Has that sort of step been taken even in the interim while a more holistic approach is taken to remedying the gaps identified?
I know we have been having discussions with the Children's Authority, and I think that agency would be better able to speak to that. But what I would say is that we have been addressing with them some of the issues as regards to licensing that has to do with infrastructural and those types of issues. The issue of monitoring and what's happening in the children's homes, we have had discussion with them, but that is really their remit.
Thank you. We get on to the Children's Authority and ask that question. Thank you so much, Madam PS. We move now, Member Nakin. The floor is yours, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services.
Hello. Good morning.
Thank you.
Yes. I would like to address the ministry concerning the dominant age of the perpetrators. As their submission indicated that age range was between 30 and 59 years of age. How does the ministry intend to address the issues of domestic violence within this age group? And has the ministry conducted a study to determine the factors that account for domestic violence to be the highest within this age range?
Chairman, domestic violence is a learned behavior, and the Ministry of Social Development is treating with it in the context of family violence, which is part of our responsibility to build resilient families in the country. So it is treated within the context of family and the development of families in Trinidad and Tobago. The age group that we are talking about, where this is prevalent, it comes from the research that have been conducted in the past with relation to domestic violence. And those reports have been published. There's several of them coming out of the Office of the Prime Minister and coming out of the research undertaken by NGOs that we have leveraged on to make an assessment of what's happening with domestic violence. A lot of the things that we understand and have come out of the kinds of research done previously by the Office of the Prime Minister, and which we were recently concluded under the Spotlight initiative. So that's our source of information, along with that provided by the Domestic Violence Hotline, as well as the data supplied to us by the police. Those are the sources of information, in addition to the trends that we look at being reported internationally by the Women's Arm of the United Nations. Yeah. In terms of specifically addressing that group, as I said earlier, it's being managed within the context of building family, and in particular, family violence. So we're treating with it in the form of our parenting program. There's a gender element there. There's a family conflict and violence element there, through our partnership with the other agencies, the police, the OPM, and the Ministry of Education on the Foundations program. Those are some of the things that we are focusing on. We have segmented our parenting program to deal specifically with some groups that we feel would bring some relief to violence in the country, and we have a set strategy that we're pursuing to treat with family violence in collaboration with all the other key stakeholders.
I appreciate your answer, but since you mentioned the importance of family in your attempt to address the issue, and we know that when we bring it down to the ground level, we have serious challenges with what we consider stable families, especially in some of the disadvantaged communities. How are you going to address that? Single mother homes, absentee fathers. How has that been addressed by the ministry?
Chair, the ministry has a social protection system in place which addresses vulnerability, families and individuals with vulnerabilities. And we would agree that we have not been able to identify all of them, but there are some things that are happening at the ministry now, which would help the situation immensely. One of them being the establishment of the vulnerability register, a household register for the country. The ministry.
Could you just, sorry to interrupt, could you just, what is the vulnerability registry? And is it based on doing a national scan to see what types of vulnerabilities exist where? Because if you look at the data provided by the TTPS, you may not have been privy to it. There are specific areas that are showing to be higher in reports of domestic violence. Northern 1,423, Central 964, Southern 835, and Tobago 848. So on a cursory level, there is some data existing that is telling us something is happening in these divisions in terms of the police data. But if we don't have a scan to say where the other factors that may be contributing to family dysfunction exist, I'm trying to figure out how we're crafting the policy and the prioritization of resources to those areas that are showing to be vulnerable and deficient in some areas, in some departments and dimensions.
And Chair, yes, we have been with the police service. The areas which they have identified are indeed some of the vulnerable areas that we have. We are currently strategizing on for an intervention. And those are the 3 or 4 areas that we have selected as priority. So we are liaising with the police service, the Office of the Prime Minister, Community Development, Education. The Ministry of Social Development understands that it's not only the key, while it is a key social sector agency, it has, in order to treat with family violence, we have to engage in strategizing and prioritizing the areas. There is a reason why we chose to pilot our social security empowerment services in Rio Claro and Tunapuna. Those were areas identified very early for priority treatment. So we are using the data to establish our priority areas for intervention and the strategy. I just quickly say that the vulnerability register, which the consultant is currently addressing, aims to identify all the households in Trinidad in terms of their vulnerability status. And a household or an individual may have one vulnerability, and others might have a multiple vulnerability.
Could you just give us a sense of what the categories of vulnerability your scanning involves, just so we get a sense of what it entails?
It's your social vulnerabilities, your economic vulnerability, and within that there are lots of segments. So your social vulnerability may mean that there is dysfunction. There is dysfunctionality in the family in terms of the education, your ability to place to treat with your psychosocial condition in the family. The economic vulnerability may revolve around your ability to place food on your table. So those are some of the vulnerabilities that we have to look at. It may mean your physical ability. That's one of the vulnerabilities that we have to look at. What we want to get is to identify those households which are vulnerable and need priority attention, while we identify those that are potentially vulnerable in the event that the economy suffers some kind of shock, for example, like COVID. and how we can move and eliminate vulnerability. So we move people to a position where they can be self-sufficient. So that's the purpose of the vulnerability register. Senator Naked asked.
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yes, question relating to how we're dealing with that 30 age group. Is that the question, Senator Naked? I think I lost a bit the question. Through you, Chair.
That was the first question, Madam. It was about the age range you had here in your submission, that the age range of 30 to 59 years of age has the highest number of victims and perpetrators of domestic violence. And I ask you, how did you intend to address the issues of domestic violence within that age group?
Yes, and more specifically, the intention here is to treat with it when we address our families while addressing our family strategy. One of the things is to treat with it at the level of the family, yes, but you have to treat with it at the level of the education system, and that's why we have been supporting the introduction of the family life education at the Ministry of Education, the use of the foundation program there as well within the schools. But more specifically, we have targeted our parenting program, and more recently our discussions with the police and the other agencies will lead to a more focused strategy on this particular age group.
Well, then obviously the question becomes, since you said in your submission that you had serious human resource needs, that you were not well-resourced in terms of your human resources, then how are you going to have the optimum level of efficiency that you seek to achieve if you're not well-resourced, that you can fill those vacant positions that you have, especially within the National Family Services Division and the parenting unit? How is that going to be achieved?
Chair, we have been doing a lot in our parenting program. We have gone virtual with that program, and we're due to come back face-to-face within communities on that program. So yes, I agree, we are resource constrained, but we have been asking the Commission to support with filling the positions, and we have advertised the family services social worker. So we are in the process of filling those vacancies. Because there's ample evidence that we need to get back into the communities to do the work to develop resilient families.
Okay, I understand you're in the process, but when do you envision that the ministry will have these vacancies? What is the time? Give us a timeline.
We hope by the end of the fiscal year, we'll be going out with we have been out with our advertisement. Some of them are the shortlisting stage. We are currently doing interviews, for example, for our crisis hotline. We have been out with our advertisements for our specialized family services social workers. So we hope to be up and ready by the end of this fiscal. As I said, we are trying to prioritize and use the resources we have available to deal with those strategic issues and those priority areas that we have seen based on the data.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Given that the lockdown measures would have hindered the victim's ability to find a safe location to call or report to NFSD, how was the NFSD able to assist victims of domestic violence who needed that support during the pandemic?
Chair, we the NFS operates usually on the 8 to 4 system, but our case workers are usually available outside of those periods when we have to treat with disaster situations. When an urgency arises, it is not that the division is on an 8 to 4, and we have seen it in many instances where we find ourselves by our clients on weekends and on public holidays and beyond the normal workday. But I'll let Ms. Saka, our Director, National Family Services, expand on that.
Please.
Good morning, Senator, and
Good morning.
other members of the team and my co-workers present today. NFS has, in terms of how we would have addressed it during the COVID period, all staff were still on call. They would have worked from their homes. They would have, the telephone extensions were routed to their cell phones so that they were able to take calls during this period. This continues, and we were able to do we were also able to do interviews via WhatsApp, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Messenger, and even the normal telephone. However, these persons were able to reach out to us. We were available. We made ourselves available. As P.S. Johnson indicated, we do not function on an 8 to 4 basis. We are available 24/7 for anyone who needs support.
That is very commendable. Very commendable. But I'm interested in the financial support that you receive. Have all the organizations under your remit received the quarterly financial support for 2022?
Chairman, are you referring to the NGOs under our remit? Is it that you're asking?
They are the organizations in receipt of financial support from the ministry.
Subvention. Chair, I take it it's subventions Senator Naked is referring to?
Senator Naked?
Yes, there will be subventions. These organizations will have their financial subventions from the ministry. Have they received the quarterly financial support for 2022?
Yes. Ms. Hiralal will provide an update.
Good morning, committee and senator. The answer to that is yes for the NGOs under the purview of the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, specifically for those providing support for victims of domestic violence and abuse. They would be in receipt throughout the period of the pandemic, March 2020 to 2022. They would have received their quarterly allocations once in compliance with the ministry's monitoring and reporting process. And that basically entails financial oversight and monitoring to ensure compliance as well as service deliveries.
Okay.
Senator Naked, one more question before we move to Children's Authority, please. Thank you.
Yes, one more. Well, it falls in what the good lady just said. I would like to refer to the Rape Crisis Society of Trinidad and Tobago. With regard to the recommendations from the assessment report on that particular organization and the Red Cross Society, how does the ministry intend to assist the societies in the implementation of the recommendations of the assessment report?
Our support for NGOs looks at an organizational capacity and strengthening perspective. So we are working on a case by case. It's not an immediate process. There are some governance issues that need to be looked at in terms of strengthening governance of these organizations, as well as reporting, strengthening the reporting process. So as you would well be aware, NGOs are primarily run on volunteer resources. And as a result of that, it is a constant cry that, administrative requirements tend to be quite burdensome sometimes. The NGO unit is available to provide the type of support and handholding that's needed to address these recommendations. So having an identifiable work plan at the start of the fiscal period, so we understand the level of activities being undertaken by these organizations. Also looking at compliance in terms of the ministry's reporting process, such as timely submission of reports to account for state funds, such as income and expenditure statements, actual income and expenditure statements, as well as audited financials. That forms part of the ministry's process. So we are working on a case by case with both of the organizations identified. Resourcing as well in terms of capacity tends to be a challenge for these organizations, heavily dependent on volunteer resources, as I mentioned. So we are reviewing those recommendations towards implementation with regards to further strengthening to ensure efficient service delivery.
And maybe the chairman can help me here. As you remembered in our last meeting, Chairman, that the Rape Crisis Society had some serious complaints about their subventions or whether any donations from the government. Do you remember exactly, Chairman, what was the complaint?
I think it was Lifeline, actually.
Lifeline? The hotline, the Rape Crisis Hotline, correct, Chairman?
My memory is pointing me to Lifeline as opposed to Rape Crisis Hotline.
Okay, Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Member Naked, and thank you to the officials of the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Children's Authority, you're up next. Thank you for your patience. I'm looking at the breakdown of state funding provided by the Children's Authority for the period March 2018 to March 2022, where it states March to September 2018 received 28.1 million, 2019 64.9 million, 2020, 68.9 million, 2021, 88.7 million, and for 2022 up to March, 32.4 million. So the question to start to the acting director is the authority adequately resourced at this time, financially and otherwise?
Mr. Chairman, I think I can speak for a number of state agencies when I say that we would like to receive more funding than we currently receive, especially given the stringency of our economic times. We do receive funding at the midterm review. We have consistently gained increases in our funding, but in terms of overall funding, we would like to see an increase going forward.
Where would you say the priority areas lie in terms of where this increased funding would be focused on in terms of more effectively running the authority?
Since the inception of the authority, we have seen an increase in the number of reports of abuse coming to the authority. When the authority was conceptualized, it was envisaged that the number of cases of abuse may have been in the order of less than 2,000 per year. However, we have seen an average of 4,000 plus cases of abuse per year coming to the authority. So I would say that a lot of the increased funding would be allocated to engage in additional resources to deal with the number of cases of abuse. Children who come to us with varying symptomatology based on domestic violence and other acts perpetrated against them in the context of the family. We also see that we would be partnering in a more intensive way with our domestic partners, or for example, the Ministry of Social Development, to help strengthen the family mechanism and make families more resilient. Relative to our funding, we also recognize that there is a need for placements of children. Now, we have been experiencing what is called the placement crisis. We would like to see an increase in the number of foster parents and in the number of adoptions. So we can envisage an increased funding to treat with increasing our foster care programs. So additional persons can open their hearts and homes to our vulnerable and needy children.
How many care center, residence centers are presently operated by the authority?
Four centers, please.
4 centers. Given what has happened in the past, I think it's just over a year, where there were certainly gaps identified in security arrangements in particular, one of these. Has an audit been done in terms of the security and monitoring protocols at these residences to ensure that recurrence of the past issues don't happen?
Yes, please, Mr. Chair. And I would venture to say that the board has in fact recognized that there are systemic shortcomings, and the board, in its wisdom, had ordered an audit of the system. And based on that, work has been ongoing at the authority to address some of the systemic issues.
Now, you would understand that someone listening to that and understanding the remit of the authority in regulating and monitoring situations of child abuse and ensuring children are protected, having not been able to audit itself in that instance adequately, would raise red flags. So is it that you had a system in place that wasn't adequate, or was there some sort of gap that developed due to some resource shortcoming? What actually happened?
Mr. Chair, relative to that specific issue, I would not go into the specifics of that, but what I can see relative to security, we have identified that a change in how we approach security is required. Therefore, security agents are not just there to secure plant as in a normal establishment. They are also there to help secure fragile, vulnerable children in need of care and protection. So at this moment, we are fine-tuning our own proposal to increase the number of security agents, security personnel within our establishment. But we are now proceeded, we wish to proceed on the basis that these officers will be more akin to care officers, an extension of our care and protection mechanism in safeguarding the children who come to our care.
Given the circumstances surrounding I don't want to use the word escape, but the escape of the young persons recently, and the suggestion that there may have been some sort of gang affiliation, is part of the new protocol also working with the TTPS in identifying possible high-risk residents who may need protection themselves, but through whatever exigent circumstance in their life may also be more vulnerable, and because they're being housed and protected, need a different level of protection for that particular residence in conjunction with the TTPS. Is that part of the consideration, given what has transpired?
At present, Mr. Chair, the TTPS is rendering assistance in the review of our security system. So what you have suggested will be part of the consideration. However, we also recognize that there is a greater need in the intake and assessment of our children to identify these red flags to help us to assist them in a better way. We have also reached out to the OPM, and the OPM has in fact delegated a resource to help us in identifying children who are vulnerable because of drug use and drug abuse.
Has there been also a focus on children who are victims of sexual abuse that would have come to the authority's attention, so the authority would have moved them out into safer environments?
Could you repeat the question, please, Chair?
Given what the TTPS data is on situations of child abuse and abandonment, in some cases sexual abuse, is there a focus on that aspect of the authority's mandate in protecting children from those situations and providing the type of rehabilitation services for those children?
Yes, Chair. Whenever there is an allegation of abuse, there's an investigation within the authority. The matter is also referred to the TTPS.
Given the number of reports that the authority, as you indicated, receiving over 4,000 reports now, and which is substantial, that must take a lot of resources to investigate all those, because I think it's part of your mandate to investigate each report that reaches your desks. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
So that to me is monumental. What are the indicators used to assess if a child is in imminent danger and needs to be removed?
In relation to that question, Chair, I refer the question to Mrs. Gregory Rupchan, Deputy Director, Care.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good day, everyone. With respect to the steps that we use to determine if a child is in imminent danger, that is tasked to the investigation or the emergency team in the second instance. In the first instance, we task that our registry team. They are the ones who take the call from members of the public and determine by the different factors of the case reported to us whether that child is likely to be in imminent danger. Our next step is to determine how we will action that case and which team we will send. In imminent danger situations, as indicated in our submission, we aim to investigate and to mitigate risk to a child within 24 hours, and that starts our emergency response team. The factors we look for are whether there is bodily harm likely to be happening to the child, whether there is emotional harm likely to be happening to the child, and all of this is based primarily on the child's voice, which is our main guide in terms of understanding the child's circumstances. A part of that process also is ensuring that we take information from collateral sources, other family members, persons in the community, other practitioners who may have been involved with the child, and take the necessary steps to then mitigate risk to the child. So what we're doing is substantiating the allegation that is before us, which will tell us the level of risk to which the child is exposed to, and then determining what next steps we must make to ensure that that child is safe. In some instances, as a last resort, it may mean receipt into care. So those are some of those are the processes that we go through to determine if a child is in fact in imminent danger.
What happens from the authority's perspective, because Ms. Johnson at the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services raised a very important point earlier on, and she indicated, and she was correct, that abuse is a learned behavior. What happens in circumstances in households and in children's residences and homes when the alleged perpetrator is another child who may have learned that behavior from being abused, unfortunately, and now is carrying on this cycle of abuse with other children in that space or in some instances in homes? What is the protocol of the authority in those cases?
The authority will treat a child who is a perpetrator as a child because, as you said, we have some understanding, being in the sector that we are in, as to what may have brought that child to become a perpetrator in the first instance, possibly exposure to violence. Our next steps will be to secure and put in a safety plan, if that is in the best interest of the child, to ensure that the victim is not harmed any further. Our case management officers are then tasked to provide the interventions for both children, both the victim and perpetrator, to one, curtail the behavior of perpetration going forward, and more importantly, to understand the root cause of that behavior. So that will be part of the case management goals of the team that will manage those children cases going forward. Now, in the situation of imminent danger, if we determine that that cannot be done while the children remain in their current environment, we will consider exploring an alternative environment, possibly a family member, and so on, so that we can put in place a safety plan to ensure that harm does not continue while the interventions happen.
Has the authority been involved in the dealing with children who may, in the homes that have been identified in the recent report of having been victims of abuse, in having been victims of neglect or a lack of standard of care, in one, removing those children and also working with the TTPS in terms of identifying persons who may pose a risk to children in those circumstances, in those homes?
Absolutely, and that's an excellent question. I thank you for it. With respect to our collaboration with the TTPS and Ms. Clegaya, who is one of our main stakeholders and collaborators, the police often work with us to be able to go out and determine what are the allegations and substantiate them in relation to how they can move the criminal matter forward. The authority does the psychosocial investigation that focuses on satisfying the needs of the child. So that collaboration helps us to take the steps to determine if a child needs to be moved out of a particular situation. And that also helps us to feed into our investigation from the criminal aspect, whether there are other dangers in the community, in other family members, etc., that we must consider before placing the child. Now, part of the placement process.
So just before you go, so are you comfortable, given the report that I'm sure you've had access to, that all the dangers have been removed from those homes in terms of personnel who may be subject to investigation, one, or who may, in your opinion, given your identifying markers in your interviews with children, continue to pose a risk to other children if they are identified in that report as possible perpetrators? Has that process been done?
Specific to your question in relation to community residences and
yes.
Well, the licensing and monitoring department of the authority is tasked to go in and to explore every allegation that comes to our attention that a child is in fact likely to have been abused. That is their remit, and in collaboration with other units, they go in to explore and conduct the same process I mentioned before to understand or substantiate the allegation, and those are the steps that we are taking. To say that I am totally satisfied with the steps that that all danger is completely removed from any of the children's homes is not something we can safely say, simply because as time evolves, circumstances evolve, and we need to continue as we have been to ensure that we explore and look at opportunities to even improve existing systems, as well as hear the voice of a child should we have not explored anything in full at any point.
Let me just, I'm going to member Naked and member Beckers in a short while, but the TTPS is still with us. And I'm sure the TTPS has had sight of that report that was recently presented. Has there been any move to ensure that alleged perpetrators have been removed from those situations? And this is to the TTPS. Because while it's being investigated, I would shudder to think that while an investigation is ongoing and a person is presumed innocent until otherwise proven guilty, that there are questions hanging over supervisors, heads, etc., that may continue to pose a danger to children. TTPS, still there?
Well, yes, thanks for the question. Yes, the investigative team, they are in the early stages of doing the investigation, and in fact, some persons ask, yes, we have persons coming forward giving statements, but they have not that 5 persons who are within these homes that they can recommend to remove immediately from the homes. That is ongoing. The investigation is ongoing, and as we get the information, right, and evidence, we will in fact make the requisite recommendations. But at this time, no.
In charge of the Gender-Based Violence and Child Protection Unit, given the fact that these reports, according to what is in the public domain, had been done as much as 6 months ago, are you comfortable with the fact that some children may still be in danger? If the report proves to be true in the long run, and while I'm sure there's a process involved in investigating, I think the priority needs to be the child and the protection of the children in those homes. And given the damning nature of that report that I had sight of, I would shudder to think that some sort of temporary situation has not been initiated to ensure that even allegations are treated in a particular way to protect children at all costs.
As Commissioner would have alluded to before, I would just like to add that with respect to the Justice Jones investigation, a few of those reports are actually engaging the attention of the Child Protection Unit at the moment. One of the things I would like the public to know is that when it comes to removing a child, we as the investigative unit at the Child Protection Unit, we would make a request for the alleged perpetrator to be removed from where the victim or the survivor is at the moment. However, when it comes to removal, the body that is fasted with that duty under the laws is the Children Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. But a lot of times we would make that demand. Here's what, that is our victim, and for the victim's safety, we would like the perpetrator to be removed immediately.
You made that demand in this case or in any of these instances of the authority?
All instances. In all instances.
So I'm going back to the Children's Authority now. The ball is in your court. Has that been done given the gravity of the situation identified in that Jones report?
We need to speak about what happened.
That a demand was made to us? Right.
If a request has been made to remove any supervisor who may be alleged to be involved in abusing children in these homes identified in the Jones report.
Or even the children too.
I'm not aware that a request has been made to the authority in that regard.
Thank you so much. Member Naked, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sometimes if it's a supervisor.
Yes, to the acting director of the Children's Authority, just a simple question before I exit. I would just like to know what, since you spoke about the synergy with the authority and the TTPS, and the TTPS stated that the normal protocol, if there was some incident within the authority, you would immediately contact the TTPS. Is that correct?
That is the usual and correct procedure, yes.
Is it protocol to contact anybody outside of the TTPS to investigate a matter?
I am not clear on your question, please.
If, for example, the boys that absconded, and it was stated that the TTPS was contacted, I'm asking, is it normal protocol for anyone else other than the TTPS to investigate those boys absconding? Would somebody be contacted? Would a community leader or someone else be contacted?
I'm not aware of a protocol that requires that from the authority standpoint.
Thank you very much.
Member Beckles?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go back to the issue of counseling and to inquire whether or not the authority is satisfied that they have the resources based on all the discussions today to be able to address the issue of counseling for the persons who are at the facility.
I invite Mrs. Gregory-Chan to respond to this honorable member.
Good morning again. With respect to counseling, the authority does have a number of case managers whose responsibility it is to provide that level of counseling. We also have a number of psychologists. We currently have just 4 psychologists at the authority at the moment who does some of the therapeutic interventions specific to children. So to speak to your question on resources and whether we feel that we are doing enough, there's certainly more that we can do. Our current caseload for those case managers is quickly approaching 100 per person, which is not sustainable. So what we hope to do is, as we redesign the organization and look at the structure and assess our resources, we hope to be able to do even more in terms of providing counseling for children, both in their family care, in the community residences, as well as in our child support center.
Thank you very much. At this time, we're going to have to seek to wrap up, because as we said, there's a sitting of the Senate later on this afternoon. I'd like to thank all the members of the committee and also our stakeholders for being with us today. And at this time, I'd like to invite the leads of each of the teams with us to present some brief closing remarks, starting with Mrs. Jacinta Bailey-Sobers, PS OPM, Gender and Child Affairs.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to say that the Gender and Child Affairs Division, we recognize that addressing domestic violence is multifaceted, and it's so many areas that have to be addressed. And we know that we cannot do this alone, and that we need all our partners on board to make and create a kind of mindset shifts that need to take place to eradicate this scourge. So we were happy to have been here to join forces with our colleagues who were part of this session, and in future to continue to work with them to eradicate, as Superintendent Diane said, this scourge in all its forms. And so we thank you. We take note of all the areas that were mentioned here that need to be strengthened, and make the commitment to working with our partners to continue to address this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey-Sobers, and to your team for being here. Mrs. Jacqueline Johnson, PS, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services.
Thank you, Chair. I would be very short. I would want to support PS Sobers in what she said, and the work to collaborate and strategize and prioritize with regard to family violence has started among the agencies, and we need to work steadfast to ensure that that is adequately sustained at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we go to Mrs. Sharon Morris-Cummings, Acting Director of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to, in closing, indicate that a collaborative approach is required, and an all-of-government approach would see us working together to build out the child protection ecosystem of which the Children's Authority, a relatively young entity, is a part of. We look forward to continued collaboration with our partners and to increase in that collaboration across society.
Thank you so much. And to Mr. McDonald Jacob, Acting Commissioner of Police. Commissioner. Commissioner Jacob, we're not hearing you yet. Okay, well, we're going to presume that there's some technical difficulties there. Thank you, Commissioner, and your team, including Mrs. Gomez Cooper, Mrs. Claire Guy Allen, and Ms. Aisha Corby, and the actor. Yes, we hear you now. Go ahead, please. All right.
Again, on behalf of my entire team, I began to call the names. We really appreciate participating in this session this morning. And we are willing to work in partnership with all the various entities in order to deal with the whole aspect of domestic violence within Trinidad and Tobago. BIS, the investigative arm, and the reform teams in relation to the investigations, because it's very, very important that we get quick outcomes and results from these investigations. In talking with my colleagues here, yes, we have in fact made some recommendations for particular individuals to be removed from particular homes, and I think that is being dealt with. And even previous to the Justice Jones report, there were in fact investigations being done with reports made to the Special Victims Department, and in some instances there were 2 individuals who were charged. So it's a continuation of that investigation that will be taking place, because we already had the platform there during the investigation. So again, we will continue being more rigorous with our data, and in some instances, the data that we provided to you all, it can be disaggregated even to communities and even to particular variables that persons will be interested in to assist them in making the correct decisions. Our crime and criminal analysis branch and who manage our database, we have a lot of information there that can help all the various departments and government agencies to propel them forward in doing their interventions in a scientific manner. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We appreciate that. And of course, to the data you provided, you and your team have provided, which has proved extremely useful. And we appreciate that if you could send the further disaggregated data to the Secretariat, we'd also appreciate that very much. And to all the entities that appeared before us today, you have the ability to send any further information and or data or commentary to the Secretariat, which we'll be able to factor into our final report. Thank you all so much for being with us today. On behalf of the members who are with us of the committee, including Member David Naked, Member Vandana Mohit, Member Penelope Beckles, and the members who could not be with us due to conflicting engagements, I would like to thank the members of the Secretariat and Parliament for, of course, as usual, providing human service. Thanks to all stakeholders for their participation, and also the staff and office of the Parliament for your procedural and logistical support as per usual, and of course to you, the viewing and listening audience, for being with us today. Thank you so much. This meeting is now adjourned. Have a good afternoon.